pitch to me is a very big and very important episode in the entire series. Not the best one, of course, but one of them. And to me, it was a turning point in the series with the pitch, which this one and the next episode we do the ticket. Those two, like the stories, collide. Even though the pitch begins the first season arc in the series, which this is what led to season 4 also being known as the breakthrough season, which we'll also talk about that in this episode right here. We talk about how season 4 was the breakthrough season. So of course the pitch, the idea of the story is, again, it starts a season-long arc, which it's basically Larry David's idea of, him and Jerry, in real life went through a lot of experiences putting this show together. So, the show can be about, waiting at a Chinese restaurant or, going on a trip to Hollywood trying to track down your friend who's, left you on bad terms. The fix-up. We've had stories about, from the letter in the last episode with Elaine being forced to take off an Orioles cap in the Yankees owners' box seats and whatnot. All these crazy stories. Wouldn't it make sense for the Jerry in the show to be asked by NBC, like the Jerry in real life was, to do a pilot? Which, of course, Jason Alexander at first mentions that when he was first told that season 4 was going to have an arc, again, he wasn't too crazy about it. Just like he wasn't too crazy about, in the Trip episode, Kramer being a murder suspect. Because as he says, a lot of things we had done before then was a lot more, relatable to the average audience, to the average mind. He didn't think this was going to be the case. Until they started doing it, and, who he had to work with and whatnot, everything like Bob Balaban, who played Russell Dalrymple. Funny backstory behind him. I'll get to that, of course, in this review. This is going to be probably a longer video because there's a lot to say about the pitch episode. And, of course, this being, the key point to the beginning of the breakthrough season. He was wrong. Because, again, this led to them, coming up with material over a season-long arc. They got an Emmy in this season for Best Show because of one certain classic episode that actually will be taking place on the next disc that I watch for the series, which I'm very excited to talk about that. It was just, this to me, this episode was like the biggest turning point and what led to Seinfeld, becoming the number one show, pretty much. Because this also was the season where NBC was contacted by Ted Danson, who, of course, George references in The Ticket, The Wallet, and The Watch, the next 3 episodes following this, that Cheers was going to be going away. And there was a lot of shows that was, where it was dwindling off, and NBC was in big trouble. Until then, Seinfeld was on Wednesday nights. And, it was good, getting good numbers. It wasn't the best show, though. It still felt like it was only having that audience where only certain people would understand it. They wanted to still, feel like they were a show that could catch everyone's attention. And, with Cheers going away, they obviously had other shows they needed to, air around Cheers to kind of get that attention. Seinfeld was moved in January, I think it was, because the episode The Shoes in season 4 was the first episode to air on Thursday nights at 9:30 following Cheers, which was at the 9 o'clock slot on Thursday nights, which was like the premier time slot, for television. Not just that, of course, but of course, the contest, which we'll talk. I don't want to get into too much details about the contest because the breakthrough season, it feels like it takes like other pieces of the inside look and put them together. So I don't want to completely go into details about the contest, but obviously the contest was one of those episodes where it was like, they had some concerns at the beginning, but, they went for the ride and, it got through beautifully. It was one of those episodes that you just didn't want to walk into, the office the morning after the show aired and not talk about that episode. But once they moved to 9:30 on Thursday nights, when they followed Cheers, they were actually beating Cheers in ratings, and you hear more of lines being repeated. You more hear the phrase of, like, this is such a Seinfeld moment, which is very common in my family, believe it or not, as I've probably said millions of times. That led to them moving to, one, getting, I think, Best Show for Season 4, where they got an Emmy with the contest, and the following fall, when they began Season 5, Seinfeld moved to 9 o'clock on Thursday nights on NBC, which is like the premiere time slot. And of course, that's where, the show just like was told, basically said, hey, we've arrived, we've done something, we've done the work to get the audience, now let's just put on the show for them, basically. And it all, to me, started with this episode, The Pitch, which a lot of people probably say it started with The Pitch, with this long, season-long story arc that, again, was just basically telling the same story, mostly, I wouldn't say completely, that Larry David and Jerry and Larry had gone through when they were putting together this show. Of course, at the end of the season, the show didn't get the show within the show, the Jerry show, did not get picked up. Which we'll, of course, talk about that when we get to the 2-part finale of this season. So, other than that, let's talk about the actual story. So the story starts again. They've just gotten back recently from their trip to L.A. and of course Kramer's back in town. Elaine, of course, was still kind of away on maternity leave, so they had her appear once in The Pitch and once in The Ticket, in a scene where the story was for Elaine was that she was on vacation overseas and she was having a thing with her therapist, Dr. Reston. And the two scenes they showed was them kissing, in like Paris, I think was one. I can't remember what the other one was. And Dr. Reston just kept interrupting their moment, saying that he was concerned about this certain patient of his, where that he wasn't taking his medication, and also knowing that he forgot to leave. And then the second one, which was in The Ticket, he forgot to leave him a certain medication, which of course would introduce the character Crazy Joe Davola, who was named after an ABC executive. Actually, there was a lot of future key characters that was introduced in The Pitch and The Ticket. But again, I'm keeping them, separated to review both shows, even though The Pitch and The Ticket originally aired as a 1-hour episode. So they were back in New York, of course. Jerry was at an improv club, just doing some improv, and George is there. They were hanging out and just talking when a couple of NBC executives approach him. One of them was a stand-in for Rick Ludwin, who originally was asked to play himself. That didn't happen. They had Kevin Page play a guy named Stu, and he played him instead. And same thing, basically approached him saying, NBC's been talking about you. They're interested in, doing some type of work. He said, give us a call and maybe give us an idea based off your stand-up routine or something like that. Which, of course, he gets in the conversation with George about, and George immediately saying stuff like, why is it that hard? Because, look at all the junk that's on TV. So, he's being pitched ideas, like George said something about him being a gymnastics instructor, and he's pushing his son to become a gymnast, and Jerry's like, who wants to do that? Kramer pitched an idea to him about him working in an antique store, and him, basically, taking an interest in his clients' lives, which Jerry wasn't about that. Then there was some circus idea that Kramer threw in there also, and then he was just like, no, I don't know about that either. So he was struggling, he was having writer's block, had a hard time coming up with an idea. In the midst of this conversation, which, I'm sorry, no, not yet. No, I'm sorry. In the midst of this conversation, Newman comes in. And I guess Kramer and Newman had made a deal with each other that Newman would give Kramer his motorcycle helmet, which Jerry was shocked to hear that. And apparently Newman had a wild girlfriend, which Jerry doubts that Newman would have a woman. And then Kramer was going to give Newman in return for his radar detector. Newman, of course, made it seem like that, his helmet. Jerry could tell that, that helmet was no match to, that radar detector. which, Jerry then tries to, tell one or the other, like, hey, they're ripping you off. They get an argument over it, but they still switch. Jerry, of course, then finds out from Kramer that the radar detector actually does not work, which will play into effect later on in the show. So then Jerry and George were at Monk's, just talking, having a conversation about salsa. Just some simple, goofy conversation. George, of course, mentions the idea of, like, this should be the show. This should be the show. And then Jerry's like, what do you mean this should be the show? He goes, just us, just talking. What are we talking about? What's the show about? It's about nothing. And then Jerry's like, so I'm going to NBC and I'm telling them I have an idea for a show about nothing. George goes, we go into NBC. And then Jerry's like, wait, why are you getting involved in this? He goes, I'm no writer, but we're just talking about a sitcom right here. So then they're saying, well, who would be on the show? And of course, George mentions, that he could be a character. Kramer can be a character. Elaine can be a character. They all can be characters, pretty much. And then Jerry goes, I still get what the show's about, though. He goes, it's about nothing. So they go back and forth, and basically Jerry's like, okay, it's sort of basically based off, like a day in the life of, real life experiences. Of course, also, it's kind of like, just based off, like, the stand-up material that he shares, having, like, a story based on that in some ways. Or, like, like, the theme of it in some ways, basically. Of course, though, he goes back to his apartment, and he has a conversation with Kramer. And it's literally the same conversation Larry David had with Kenny Kramer, saying that, he doesn't like the idea of a character being based on him. So finally, after going back and forth, Kramer agrees for Jerry to, have a character based off of him under one condition. He gets to play Kramer. In which Jerry goes, you can't play Kramer. He's like, well, why not? He goes, because you can't act. He's like, just like, blown away from that, like, saying I can't act. So Newman walks in, and then Jerry goes, fine, I'll get Newman to play Newman instead. He's like, what do you mean? And then he's like, never mind. Like, you think Jerry would really have a character based on Newman in his own series? I mean, I'm sure, well, if the show would have gotten picked up, he would have probably had to go down that path at some point, but, Newman came in, though, and was freaking out because that he found out the radar detector does not work because Newman got a speeding ticket. And he was blaming Kramer for it because he gave him a bad radar detector, and, of course, obviously he's trying to get out of Kramer. He knew that radar detector was bad. So that's more of a story for the ticket, which we'll get into that in a little bit. Although that helmet, though, Kramer has, does come into play later on. So then George and Jerry are sitting outside in the lobby at NBC waiting to have their meeting. And, of course, Jerry seems like cool and collected. George is like quiet and not talkative. And then Jerry's trying to get out of George. George is nervous. He goes, what are we doing? He goes, it's like one of those few times where George, was actually like, like he had something going and he's choking out on it. Kind of like how eventually in season 7, where he was all for, him getting engaged and actually focusing on trying to, build a relationship with someone instead of being like, picky and whatnot. And then the last second, of course, he's chickening out, saying like, this is a big mistake, I can't be doing this. Same thing, of course, is happening right here, which, of course, that woman he almost marries, we meet here. So so then, of course, they're freaking out and everything. But while they're waiting, Jerry sees Crazy Joe Davola. And, he's trying to avoid being seen, but then Joe sees him. And they just have like an awkward back and forth exchange. And earlier in the episode also, Kramer mentions he's going to have a party, and he's inviting, the guys over. Of course, Newman said because of the bad radar detector, he wasn't going to come to the party. Well, Jerry, again, just trying to, throw something out there because the conversation was getting very weird, and he was obvious that Joe was not going to walk away. He mentioned something about Kramer's party, which Joe does not take it too well because he was not invited to Kramer's party. And, of course, which leads to what happened at the end of the pitch, which we'll get to that shortly. they're called in. Of course, George is freaking out, like, like they're people with jobs, like, successes, like, they're like, he's nothing compared to them. And Jerry's trying to say, you're being crazy. Of course, they walk in and they all stand up, and obviously they're all serious and everything, and it's just like, holy smokes. So, of course, this is the scene where we first meet Russell Dalrymple, who's played by Bob Balaban, who's supposed to be, like, the one sitting in for Warren Littlefield. Like, obviously, he's playing the part of Warren Littlefield as the president of NBC, but of course, he has a different name and whatnot. A funny story, though, about Dalrymple, though. I had a basketball coach years ago who I did not like. And in the episode "The Shoes" was actually the first episode I ever remember being when I was watching Seinfeld growing up. Was the first episode I remember coming across where I met Dalrymple, and that's where Dalrymple gets sick from the pasta primavera, and I'm just like, oh boy, well that's my coach getting his payback for it. Because he was a bad coach. But Dalrymple will remind me of him. This is also the scene where we first meet Susan Ross, played by Heidi Sweeberg, who would be the biggest, strongest relationship that George has throughout the entire series. And of course, which I'll get to her more in a second, especially when we get to a pivotal scene in this episode. So they have the meeting, and first, with how nervous George was, he's telling Jerry to do all the talking. So of course they're talking about things. Dalrymple asks George if he's written anything. He comes up with some Broadway play that he claims he wrote, which obviously was not true. That actually, in a second meeting they had in the ticket, they actually asked him if they could see a copy of that, which George says is the damnedest thing. I moved and they lost some of my stuff, and I'm still, getting involved with the movers about that. But obviously, where Dalrymple's like, okay, so what'd you guys come up with? And Jerry starts basically explaining, it's more of like a day in the life episode. I think if Jerry would just explain, it's more of like a day in the life episode of him, and like stories based off of experience based off his stand-up routine, and it would have been fine. George, though, is like, this is the first of several times at the beginning of this pilot of this the Jerry Show TV series where I have a friend Joe, where George just about blows it. He mentions how the show is about nothing, and Dalrymple's like, what does that mean? Tell me about the stories. What's the premise? And of course, Jerry keeps trying to say, because George asked Dalrymple, what'd you do today? He goes, I became the work. He goes, there's a show. And then Dalrymple's like, how's that a show? And then Jerry goes, well, something probably happens along the way. And then George's like, no, nothing happens. It's like, okay, yes, something happens along the way, but it's not like some super big structured show. It's just about nonsense in life, basically. Dumb luck, and I'll point out when I finally find the inside look for what happens, but literally, Jerry said this whole show should have been called Dumb Luck, because of, there was a lot of things that was out of dumb luck. But of course, my favorite part of this scene was when Dalrymple goes, well, why am I watching it? And then George goes, because it's on TV. And then Dalrymple goes, not yet. And I just love the way he says, he's like, not yet. Like, he has somewhat of an expression on his face, but not completely like a clear one. It was just hard to explain, but it just cracked me up. And then of course, George stands up, which of course, I still say, the story wasn't 100% completely like how they wanted it to be. Like, in the making of, How It Began documentary back in season 1, and in this, you learn that, Larry David was super, stubborn about a lot of things. But to me, a lot of it was, Larry David was trying to, find a reason to get out of the show. Like, he didn't really have much faith. Like, he never really looked at the numbers. I don't think so. They got for ratings. And, he didn't care that the show moved from Wednesdays to Thursdays. He's like, if they're not watching Wednesday, I don't watch them watching on Thursday. Like, he basically just always said, I hate to say he felt like he came across, he had a negative spin on things, but it's like, even though he stayed in it for so long and him and Jerry had a great time, I feel like, at times he wasn't completely on board this either. George, meanwhile, even though his character is based on Larry David, he's trying to be the one who's trying to be like, the big, tough, businessman, but what he's saying is still biting him in the butt. Which, of course, will show when it gets to the money issue in the wallet and the watch episodes. But, of course, he has this line where he comes up and says, like, maybe this idea is not for you, and I'm not going to go for, you guys manipulating their artistic integrities. This is the show, and we're not going to change anything about it. And he just motions to Jerry going, let's go. They go back to the coffee shop, and Jerry basically just, like, starts ripping him. It's this big, long monologue where it's like he just basically rips on Jerry for... He rips on George for, just completely blowing it up and saying how he needs big-time help. And he literally just, like, bashes George down to the ground. After all that, the first thing George says is, I think the girl liked me, and how he was thinking about calling her. Which, Jerry's like, you can't do that. That's not that's going to look bad on your end, basically, because obviously, it could show some, like, if Dalrymple knew there was some romance blossoming between him and Susan, then it could result in, like, looking like she's playing favoritism. Which, of course, is kind of a spoiler, about, how they eventually do get a deal. But, of course, we'll get into that in a second. So then Jerry then realizes, oh my gosh, I forgot to call Kramer. So him and George run to the phone, because George wants to call Susan, Jerry wants to call Kramer. They're arguing over the phone. I think this is where they actually showed the scene of Elaine and Dr. Reston in wherever they were in Europe. So then, back at the apartment, Jerry is telling Kramer about Joe Davola and warning him and everything. And then and of course Kramer doesn't take it too well. Then George shows up with Susan. Now let's first take a step back here for a second to put this all in perspective. In the interview on the Inside Look, Heidi Sweeberg mentions how she had heard that Susan was going to be, a reoccurring character, but there was a misunderstanding, and she thought at first she was going to be Kramer's girlfriend, not George's. So in that first scene, when George brings her up, she's saying, like, hi, friendly highs, and then when she's introduced to Kramer, because Sweeberg's mind, she thinks this is going to be a guy that I'm eventually developing, like, an affection for, she goes, hello, like, purposely. So George is about to tell Jerry some good news. The phone rings. I love this also. These instances of, like, you get phone calls from, these telemarketers, and basically they're trying to, sell Jerry something, and Jerry goes, oh, I'm sorry, I can't call you back, I can't talk right now. Can I take your own call you back? I'm sorry, we don't do that. And he's like, I guess you want people calling you at home. No. Well, not how I feel. Bam! Hangs up. Big applause. I love that moment. So then George tries to start telling him what Susan told him, and then Jerry is distracted again by Kramer, who's drinking milk. He goes, Kramer, are you drinking that milk? And then he's like, yeah, why? He goes, well, what's the expiration date on that? Which was September 3rd, which I believe this episode aired on September 16th. So making that, of course, expired milk. Kramer, of course, freaks out, and then he just turns on and throws up all over Susan. Which, of course, leads to the scene of them going back in the coffee shop, and, they're sitting there just like, this is it. It's going to, not this is only a blown relationship for George, it's going to blow their deal with NBC, because George was going to tell Jerry he brought her up because, one, he was right, she liked him, and two, she liked the idea and was behind the idea for them. And now they're both fearing that, Kramer vomiting on her dress was going to blow it. Kramer then comes in, which I can't remember if this was, I think it was not till the ticket, whenever George gets the dry cleaning bill No. I'm sorry. It was in the next. It was definitely in the next episode in the ticket. But Kramer comes in, and he says he ran into Joe Davola, Crazy Joe Davola, and he was wearing the helmet that he got from Newman, and he gets kicked right in the side of the head. His head goes all the way down the table to emphasize how strong the kick was. And he looks up and it's Davola, and he goes, that's why I think of your party. And then he says Jerry is next, basically saying he's coming out of after Jerry next, which Jerry's, terrified, of course, because he's Crazy Joe Davola. And of course, it's obvious that Dr. Reston was talking about him, saying he was worried about a patient, but he's taking his medication. It leads into the ticket, wherever he realized that he forgot to get him an extra thing of his medication, which of course obviously is leading him to kind of going a little psycho. But the kick was so hard, it left a big dent in Newman's helmet that Kramer was wearing. So Newman's helmet saved Kramer's life. And of course, George still getting on Kramer about the vomit, but that's actually how the pitch ends. With, Crazy Joe Davola's telling Jerry that with Kramer telling Jerry that Crazy Joe Davola's coming after him next, and of course the whole thing, even though they already thought they blew it to begin with, George is getting information from Susan and she's behind the idea, but now with the vomit on her, what could be next? What could be next? Could it still be, the deal could be still on? Will Davola get to Jerry? A lot of questions left as we end the first of another 2-part episode. Even though, once again, as I said, the pitch and the ticket was originally aired as a 1-hour episode. But guys, a lot to say, a lot to take in, a lot of key characters we meet in this episode. Like I said, this was the beginning of the breakthrough season. This was an episode that was like a turning point of the whole series, which what led to the high rise of Seinfeld. So guys, that does it for this review of The Pitch. What are your thoughts on The Pitch? We'll pick it up in the next review with The Ticket, which is, obviously, continues the story arc, but basically finishes up the key story, the 2 stories from this episode. Well, even though, of course, there's kind of 3, because, we have, Elaine also, and Dr. Reston, who's wondering if his patient takes medication. But, we have a lot to figure out, though, in The Ticket, which also, believe it or not, in The Ticket, is one of Wayne Knight's favorite episodes for him personally. Because we'll share that, of course, next time. So, guys, what are your thoughts on The Pitch? What are your thoughts on Season 4 being considered the breakthrough season? Do you agree? Leave your thoughts down in the comments section below. Be sure, as always, to slap a like on the video, subscribe for more content on my channel, and follow me on Twitter at DemandAirBoy93. Until then, guys, I'll see you guys in the next video, which, again, will be The Ticket. And until then, guys, I'm checking out. I will catch you all later. Peace out, everybody.